All right. Hello, everyone. Um, so great job on the exam. Our median was at 85, which was looking good. High score was 103. That said, if you're still having trouble, I'll be in contact with you. I do want to make sure that you're able to do well in this course. We have a lot of resources for you, including the SI leaders, the anatomy lab TAs. We have a wonderful tutor in the tutoring center. So we'll meet and figure out what might be going on with that. But otherwise, good work. One additional announcement, I'll post this to Brightface as well, but I will actually be leading a group of students for a visit to the Mayo Clinic on Friday. So I'll post a short video for you to watch for Friday online, but no class in here on Friday. So you can watch it in the sunshine if we got sunshine. So, hopefully a little extra long weekend will be nice for you all. Okay. So what we're going to start out talking about today, additional parts of our nervous system as we build towards our understanding of muscles eventually. But we're going to start with the autonomic nervous system. So we're going to find that the nervous system has lots of different branches. We talked about the central nervous system in unit 2 at the very end. So we're now going to start to move out to the periphery, so out to the rest of our body. And there are a number of different routes that we're going to be able to follow. Okay. So when we're thinking about the nervous system as a whole, right, we saw this picture before. I really like this picture. I kind of recommend you practice drawing a simplified version of this picture because it summarizes a lot of the information you're going to want to need. But from last time, we noticed that we have a central nervous system, which is our brain and spinal cord, right? That's our CNS. And now we're thinking about the peripheral nervous system, the PNS. So that's everything else other than the brain and spinal cord. So when we think about the peripheral nervous system, so far, all we really know about that is that we are myelinated with our Schwann cells out in the PNS. And otherwise, we haven't really thought about it. Okay, and I'll be redrawing this a bunch of times too. But our first thing that we want to think about when we're dividing up our peripheral nervous system, so we want to divide our understanding of information going in versus information going out, right? So our integrating centers, our control centers are going to be in the central nervous system, so brain and spinal cord, but they're going to need information from the rest of your body, right? So that's the information coming in part, and they're going to need to send commands out to actually do stuff. So that's the out part. Okay. So our going in part, this is going to be like sensory information, which is going to include vision, hearing, touch, positional information, and lots of receptors that you have out in your body for something like chemical compositions of things. All right. So sensory information travels on what we refer to as our afferent fibers. Right, so our afferent fibers are the ones coming in sensing. We're going from some type of receptor out in the body to the central nervous system. Right? And we mentioned that part of our homeostasis, right, part of those homeostatic mechanisms had to do with this, right? We needed to be able to sense that a homeostatically regulated variable had changed, right? So those are our afferent fibers. So that is pretty much the amount we're going to need to know for now about this sensory piece, where we're going to think about a lot more divisions, is this outgoing part. So this outgoing part are going to be what we sometimes call motor commands, but I find that word to be a little bit deceptive because motor, we're not just thinking muscles, we're not just thinking movement when we think about this outgoing part. of the nervous system. So we're going to notice that those motor commands are all traveling on efferent, going out, exiting, right, fibers. So our efferent part of the nervous system is where we're sending out commands, right? So we're sending out commands on this efferent fiber. Okay. Now, where we're sending commands, different, right? We have a lot of different kinds of commands. If you're sending commands to skeletal muscle, right? So if you're trying to tell your body, let's kick or let's move our arms, something like that, you're going to be traveling on a somatic nerve. So soma means body. So soma out to the body. Somatic nerves go to skeletal muscle. But that's the only place they go, right? Somatic nerves only going to skeletal muscle. But we have a lot of other nerves. We've got to go to the heart, which is made up of its own type of muscle. We've got to go to endocrine gland. We've got to go to smooth muscle, right? Those fibers, and those locations are all associated with the topic of today's lecture, the autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system, or the ANS, you'll see it abbreviated this way, is part of the efferent division, right? So it's going to go efferent division of the nervous system. Right? And then we have a split between our autonomic nervous system and our somatic nervous system. So when we think about the autonomic nervous system, this ANS part, right, you probably haven't thought about it too much, to be frank, in your daily life. Right? This is going to be a lot of automatic processes. So autonomic, it's going to be like automatic processes, things that are non-voluntary, that are working kind of in secret, right? So this is going to be controlling things like how fast your heart beats, what hormones you produce, how contracted are your blood vessels, right? So not something that you're consciously thinking about. And within the autonomic nervous system, we're again going to have two types of nerves, right? So our final split that we're thinking about is going to be between our parasympathetics and our sympathetics, right? So parasympathetic division and a sympathetic division. They're both going to go to the same place, right? So they're all going to go to smooth muscle, to your heart, and to your glands. But we're going to have different functions when they go there, right? So we're going to see that when we're traveling down efferent autonomic sympathetic nerve, that's going to be like the fight or flight part of your nervous system, right? So you're going to be thinking like stress when you think about the sympathetic division, right? So if you're thinking about what's it going to do to the heart, if you're coming in on a sympathetic nerve, it's going to be like speeding your heart up, making it contract harder. The parasympathetic is going to go to the heart as well, right? But it's going to have the opposite action. So this is going to be the rest and digest part of your nervous system. So it's going to slow you down. It's going to chill you out, right? So we've got these two different types of nerves going to the same location, but having opposite effects. So a brief kind of overview here. Okay. So as we're making sense of that figure and the different types of nerves, let's practice. Right? So if we are traveling in to the brain and we're carrying smell information, right? So we're thinking olfactory. What kind of fiber would we be traveling on? Okay, let's take a look. Okay, yeah, this is going to be an afferent fiber. Okay, so you might notice that this is discussing the olfactory nerve, cranial nerve 1, right? But when we're thinking about that, we're thinking about afferent, so smell coming in. So that's where we are for smell. And located in this whole system, right? What we're coming into is the brain, the central nervous system, right? And if we were going out, when I say redraw, I'm just redrawing now what I would expect you to be able to kind of add on to later on. So we'd be going out would be efferent, right? And then we divide into somatic. Versus autonomic. I'm just going to write ANS for that right here. And then we divide into parasympathetic versus sympathetic. Okay. So for smell, we're here, but we want to be able to find, based on a description of any kind of nerve, where we would locate ourselves kind of on this map. Okay. So when we talk about the autonomic nervous system, we describe it as having this dual innervation, right? Because our effector organs, which are cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and our glands for the autonomic nervous system, effector organs, that's what's going to be doing stuff. That's where we're actually going, right? Are going to have both sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves going to that same place, right? So our autonomic nerves are going to be doing this automatically, involuntarily, without you thinking about it. When we have parasympathetics coming into our effector organ, generally that's going to be related to a resting state, a relaxed state, maybe a digesting state. When we think about glands associated with digestion, parasympathetics are going to make it do stuff, right? But you're going to be relaxed here. Sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight. So in this way, with these antagonistic effects, so these opposite effects, we've got a wide range of things that we can adjust in response to a changing situation, pretty much all of which are going to be unconscious, that you are not going to be thinking about. Which is good, because a lot of these are linked into homeostasis, and you do not want to have to spend your whole day thinking about homeostasis, right? Your body needs these consistent internal conditions for all its cells to function properly. All right. So here we have a map of the two parts of the autonomic nervous system. Okay. So what we're looking at here on the left-hand side. So here are sympathetic nerves. And here are parasympathetic nerves. And when I say map now, I don't just mean like conceptual map, as you can see. We're thinking about literally where in your body do these nerves come from and where do they go? Okay. So all of these things in the center are our effector organs, right? Okay. So here we have glands in your face. So a gland above your eye, your salivary gland. Next, we've got lungs. We've got a bunch of tubes in your lungs and a bunch of smooth muscle that controls both lung tissue and blood flow. We've got the heart, which is relatively easy as an example to think about. So I do mention the heart a lot because you sense your heartbeat, right? Like you can take your pulse. But we're going a lot of other places as well with these effector organs. If we're looking at where the nerves are coming from, right, we can see, right, we've got brain and spinal cord, right? So what we're looking at is the portion of the central nervous system that we're coming from on either side. And the sympathetics in green are all coming from this middle region, right? So when they exit from your spinal cord, sympathetic nerve is going to come out somewhere between your first thoracic vertebra, so T1, and your second lumbar vertebra, L2. So we say that these nerves are thoracolumbar in origin. So they're coming from the middle, which means that they're going to have some kind of long, complicated route to get where they're going. And we'll talk about what that kind of bead-like structure is later on as we trace out the pathways of our sympathetic nervous system. But for now, notice that it's coming from the middle of your spinal cord there. Versus your parasympathetic nerves, all coming from the top and bottom, right? So here we have three cranial nerves. No, it is four. Okay, great. That's where the other one went. 4 cranial nerves, and then a couple of sacral nerves. And that's it for your parasympathetic. All right, so we refer to this origin as craniosacral, so from the top and the bottom. So anything all throughout your body is going to need to ultimately get a nerve coming from one of those two places in order to get parasympathetic innervation. So the origins of these nerves are going to be different. It's going to be one of the differences between them. Okay, so we have a diagram, and we're going to pick out a nerve that we've seen in lab. So we're going to pick cranial nerve 10, our vagus nerve. Okay, so we're going to pick out which of these things are true about the vagus nerve. Okay, let's take a look. Okay, let's think through it. All right, so we've got, for the most part, this is part of our parasympathetic division. Okay? So part of the parasympathetic division, we know partially just because of that origin, right? So it's leaving your brain, it's leaving the on a cranial nerve, right? So that craniosacral part, right? Got to be parasympathetic. While it's coming out of your brain, actually going out to the periphery. So it is still part of your peripheral nervous system. Right? So we're still going out to the periphery. We're not like staying in the brain, staying in the spinal cord, right? Which is why we're thinking of it as a peripheral nerve. And specifically, if it's part of the parasympathetic nervous system, it has to be part of the autonomic nervous system because the parasympathetics are all nested within the autonomic nervous system. Right? The autonomic nervous system just has the two parts, parasympathetic and sympathetic. But if we're not part of one, we're part of the other, and both are autonomic nerves. Okay. So that is our kind of context for what we're going to look at next as we think about the pathways of our sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves. And we're going to be thinking about, okay, what types of receptors are they going to have in different places? What types of neurotransmitters are they going to use? But now we know, like, kind of contextually, like where we are, what type of nerve we're thinking about. Okay. So we talked about synapses, right? We're going to have something that looks like something that really is a synapse out in the peripheral nervous system. But now that we're specifying a little more about what type of nerve we're talking about, we're going to have some more specialized terminology. So when we're thinking about neurons that are leaving the central nervous system, so like leaving brain and spinal cord, going out to peripheral parts of the body, so everywhere that's not brain or spinal cord, we're going to have first a preganglionic neuron. So this is like our presynaptic neuron before, but now it's preganglionic because we're headed to a ganglia, a ganglion. Sorry, ganglia is plural, ganglion is individual, right? Which is going to be a location where we have a bunch of clustered cell bodies, right? So you can actually see some of them in lab. Eventually you'll see some of them. They're going to look like little lumps, right? These ganglia when you can see them. Okay. So preganglionic neuron goes in to that ganglion, and that's where it's going to synapse with a postganglionic neuron. So again, using that pre and post prefix, and we're just referring to, are we before the ganglion or are we after the ganglion here? So when we have these autonomic ganglia, we're going to have communication from that preganglionic neuron to that postganglionic neuron. If we're thinking about some parts of like the spinal cord, we'll have some intrinsic neurons clustered inside as well, but we won't really be thinking about that. For us, preganglionic, postganglionic is what we're going to be thinking about. Now, after we hit the postganglionic neuron, that postganglionic neuron that's going to take us to our effector organs. So every autonomic nerve is going to go one of these places. So either to cardiac muscle, to smooth muscle, to some kind of glands. Then a kind of like exception to the rule in a lot of cases is going to be adipose tissue. So we are going to actually have a little bit of innervation of fat, basically. So that's kind of like an asterisk. This is going to be our lowest priority, but does count as one of the effector organs here. Okay. So here we're zooming in on the sympathetic nerves specifically, right? So we saw in that map comparing the two that their origins are different. So where they're coming out is from that thoracolumbar part of the spinal cord. So we're coming from the middle, okay? And we'll see in a second a zoomed in picture of like a cross section of the spinal cord itself. But we're even going to be coming out of like a specific part of the spinal cord, specifically a region called the lateral horn and the intermediolateral cell column. Okay. Now, when we're thinking about overall what a sympathetic nervous pathway looks like when it exits that thoracolumbar part of the spinal cord, we're going to see that the most common situation that we have is that we have a pretty short preganglionic neuron, right? So here's a preganglionic neuron, right? So a little short one, heading to this structure called the sympathetic chain. So that's what all these beads are, right? This is a chain of ganglia linked together. We're going to hop onto this sympathetic chain, and then we're going to come out and have a relatively longer postganglionic neuron that goes to an effector organ. Okay. Now I've drawn a nerve or a nervous pathway that goes into the sympathetic chain at one spot and comes out kind of at that same level. But you should notice that not all of them do that. Like this T1 nerve is going into the sympathetic chain, and then whoop, it's traveling up the sympathetic chain before it exits. Right, so this is going to be part of the point of the sympathetic chain, is that you can go up and down and kind of move around it. Yeah. So that's going to be our most common way we have our sympathetic nerves talking to each other. So on this diagram, which is a figure from your book, okay, we can see that lateral horn, so that side kind of part of the spinal cord that we're coming out of. Okay. We can see that preganglionic neuron, relatively short, going into the sympathetic chain. We can see that postganglionic neuron, which should be a little longer, usually going out to an effector organ. Okay. That's our most common way to get to an organ for a sympathetic nerve, but it's not the only way. We do have two kind of exceptions. So this is most common. So we're going to think of this as our first way of getting to an organ, but we have two more options. So basically 3 ways of getting to an effector organ if we're sympathetic. Now, one of those is going to be specific to your adrenal glands. So this one I put a 2 by before. This is a picture of an adrenal gland. I'll talk about that in a second, because that's what we're zooming in on at the bottom as well. But first, let's mention these collateral ganglia. They're really similar to the sympathetic chain, right? They're going to work the same way. We again have like a little lump that's full of cell bodies going from our preganglionic neuron. We've got this ganglion, and we have the postganglionic neuron leaving it, going through an effector organ. The only difference here is we're not attached to the sympathetic chain as a whole. We're not attached to those other ganglia. And that collateral ganglion might be kind of close to the effector organ. So that might be where you might have an exception to this short preganglionic, long postganglionic rule of thumb. Now let's zoom in on the adrenal gland one a little more, because this one's a little more complex. Okay. So when we're thinking about sympathetic innervation of the adrenal glands, your adrenal glands are adrenal, so like on top of the kidneys, right? We're zooming into where you find an adrenal gland, right? So they're like this little hat that sits on top of your kidney. Okay. And if you cut an adrenal gland in half, you're going to see that it's got layers inside, okay? So an adrenal gland has this outer section, this outer shell. Think of like the peel of an orange. That's our cortex. So that's the adrenal cortex. And then we've got this filling, right? So like the flesh of the orange on the inside. That's your adrenal medulla. Okay. And we're pointing this out because we're going to have different innervation to the cortex versus this medulla inside. Okay. So specifically, if we trace that sympathetic nerve going all the way into our adrenal gland, right? So all the way into the adrenal gland, bypassing that cortex, right? Where it synapses on this small little cell called a chromatin cell, which is like a modified postganglionic neuron. Like you took a postganglionic neuron and shrank it down, and gave it only very specific neurotransmitters that can make. Okay. So this would still be a sympathetic pathway, but it's a very specialized one, specifically for the inside of the adrenal gland. So from those chromatin cells, so those modified postganglionic neurons, we're going to be releasing 3 types of catecholamines. So basically 3 types of neurotransmitters / hormones. We lie kind of in the in-between there when we're in the adrenal gland. Okay. So we're going to see 80% of what's released is epinephrine. So loss of epinephrine, which is another word for adrenaline. Adrenaline comes from adrenal, right? The adrenal glands produce adrenaline. Unfortunately, there's a regional difference in what we call adrenaline. Here in the US, we call adrenaline epinephrine. So 80% epinephrine, okay? 20% norepinephrine, so different modified type of catecholamine, so not the same neurotransmitter, but similar, and we'll see that it has similar effects, although a couple differences. And then a tiny bit of dopamine. Okay? So those are the 3 things we might have coming from these chromaffin cells in the adrenal medulla. Okay, so from there, we're going to get epinephrine in particular, but also norepinephrine, right? Being able to leave the adrenal gland and act as a hormone as it travels through your bloodstream, which is why I said we're lying somewhere in the in-between between neurotransmitters and hormones. Because this is a neurotransmitter that will feed in the sympathetic nervous system, but when it gets into the bloodstream and affects farther parts of the body, we're going to think about it as a hormone. Okay. This is just a zoomed in picture for you of those 3 routes we can take for our sympathetic nerves, right? So we can either go preganglionic neuron into the sympathetic chain, then out on the postganglionic or neuron to an effector organ. We can specifically go to the chromaffin cells in the adrenal medulla, or we might go out to a collateral ganglion somewhere else in the body, just working the same as the sympathetic chain, but just all on our own, potentially out nearer to the effector organ itself. Okay. Let's zoom in a little bit on the relationship between the sympathetic nerves and that sympathetic chain. Okay. So this is zooming in on that most common route, right? So again, we see our preganglionic sympathetic nerve leaving the spinal cord. It's coming from that lateral horn, and then it's exiting out this part, right, of what ultimately is going to turn into our spinal nerve. So that part that's leaving there, it's called the ventral root. So ventral, going to mean like belly side. Dorsal is the opposite. So that's backside, think like a shark's dorsal fin. Right, so all of these sympathetic nerves are starting out, coming out this ventral root, out of the spinal cord. Okay. And then we can see that that ventral root and the dorsal root coming out the backside kind of meet together, and they're turning into a spinal nerve. So our preganglionic sympathetic neuron is still going on the spinal nerve. But instead of immediately going out to the body from the spinal nerve, it's jumping on to our sympathetic chain on this little arm. Ramus means arm. So the white ramus is the way we jump on to our sympathetic chain. Okay. So from there, in this sympathetic chain, we've got our ganglion, right? So here's where our ganglion, our cell body, and that synapse is with our postganglionic neuron. Okay, so to leave our sympathetic chain, we head out ultimately back to that spinal nerve and to the effector organs, but we're going to go back to that spinal nerve on a different arm than we came in on. So this is the gray ramus heading out to our effector organs. And that white versus gray, that's literally just about the coloration of those little rami coming in and out of the sympathetic chain. The white one is myelinated, the gray one isn't. That's why there's a color difference. Okay. That communication is happening in the sympathetic chain between that preganglionic and postganglionic sympathetic nerve. Okay. And here that is written out. So that's what usually happens in a sympathetic nervous pathway. Again, we have another type of ganglion that we might go through, right? So it would be a different nerve, a different pathway going somewhere else, right? We might be going to a collateral ganglion. Collateral ganglia are just collateral extra stuff, extra ganglia somewhere else. They're going to go similarly through this pathway, but they're not going to synapse in the sympathetic chain. They're going to go and synapse in a collateral ganglion, an extra one somewhere else. Okay. So that's what we want to know about our sympathetic nervous pathways for now. Right? We've got the 3 routes. One goes through the sympathetic chain, one goes through a collateral ganglion, one goes specifically through the adrenal medulla to the adrenal gland. So those are sympathetic nerves. That's that fight or flight. part of the autonomic nervous system. Now, the parasympathetic nerves and their pathways look different. Fortunately, a little simpler. Okay? So these rest and digest nervous pathways don't need a sympathetic chain. They're not going specifically to a specific region of an adrenal gland. They're just going to go most of the way there, just kind of on their own on that preganglionic neuron. So we're coming either from like the brainstem, so that's the cranial part, or sacral parts of the spinal cord, right? So craniosacral. And what we're going to do is we're going to have a long preganglionic fiber heading into the peripheral nervous system. And then we're going to have a very short postganglionic neuron to our effector organ. So when we see a parasympathetic ganglion, it's not going to be linked to any others. And it's going to be very close to the organ that we're trying to affect. So it's going to be really close to that effector organ. Ganglion still works the same way. We have the preganglionic and postganglionic linking up together in the ganglion. So that's it. We don't have to think about multiple routes for our parasympathetic nerves. Just preganglionic, postganglionic, close to the effector organ. The only thing that we want to remember extra is that we're coming from either brainstem or sacral nerves, right? So just that location that we're coming from. Okay. Since we have mentioned some parasympathetic nerves in lab, we're going to highlight them, right? So they are all going to work the way we just described. So they're going to be coming out of the brainstem in this case, because we're thinking about cranial nerves, and they're going to have ganglia relatively close to the organs that they innervate. Okay. So specifically, the cranial nerves that carry our parasympathetic innervation. Lastly, for lecture, the important one to know is the vagus nerve, which is why that was my example question for you. The reason the vagus nerve is the really important one to remember is the others don't leave your head, right? So here we see that vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10. And you can see that that's actually the one that's going practically everywhere, right? So vagus nerve is doing lungs, it's doing heart, it's doing stomach, it's doing spleen, it's doing pancreas, it's doing small intestine, it's doing large intestine, right? Vagus nerve is named for being like a vagrant, the wanderer, they call it, because it goes so far from its origin, right? So it goes, I think technically, like 2/3 of the way through the large intestine before you ever have sacral nerves start to pick up parasympathetic information. So the vagus nerve is doing like most of your body for parasympathetics. So that would be our preganglionic neuron, really is the vagus nerve here for a large section of our body. Okay. Not all the cranial nerves carry parasympathetic innervation. Probably should have clarified that before. Only a couple of them. Like a bunch of your cranial nerves just control like, you know, movement of some kind or a special sense of some kind. Specifically to be a parasympathetic nerve, we have to be doing this rest or digest function. We have to be going to smooth muscle or glands, or the vagus nerve goes to the heart. Okay. So the ones that have some of that parasympathetic innervation, your oculomotor nerve. Okay. So here you can see the oculomotor nerve goes to the eye, right? So it has a little bit of parasympathetic innervation here in the eye. Our facial nerve, cranial nerve 7, actually has several glands that it goes to. So one is your lacrimal gland above your eye, helps you cry. Also goes to salivary glands, right? So because we're going to glands, we need parasympathetic innervation, right? But we're still in your face, right? Salivation, crying, all in the face. And then our glossopharyngeal nerve also heads up to those glands, right? So technically, we've got 4 cranial nerves with parasympathetic innervation, but from now on, as we're talking about the rest of the body, really almost all the time, it's going to be the vagus nerve. So we're gonna notice that we do also have innervation from sacral nerves for our parasympathetics. Those don't have special names. They're just S2, S3, S4, named for like the level that they come out of, right? So how far down the sacrum they're coming out of. Okay. You'll see that coming out of those regions as well will also have somatic nerves, which will be traveling on their own pathways to do muscles. These parasympathetic nerves are separate. Okay. All right. So having gone through those different pathways, let's make sure that we can remember our most common one to start with. So what is our most common anatomical arrangement when we're thinking about our sympathetic nerves? Their sympathetic nervous pathways signaling from their origin to their effector organs. Okay, let's take a look. All right. Okay, so we're partway there, but let's talk through this. Okay. So luckily we picked out sympathetic chain as an important part, right? So sympathetic chain is both in the correct answer, but also in this, misspelled, but answer that a lot of you picked, right? So that part's good. But I want to point out to you, right? We only need 2 steps for any of these nervous pathways, right? We're going to have a preganglionic neuron, and then we're going to have a postganglionic neuron before we have the organ, okay? So the only problem with this first answer is it's too many steps, right? So if we were reading this pathway, we'd have 1 neuron going to the sympathetic chain, then we'd have 2, a neuron going to another ganglion, and then 3, a third neuron going to an organ. Right, so that's too many. We just want 2 neurons. That's kind of merged together our understanding of the sympathetic chain and the collateral ganglion. We have an either-or situation, right? We're either going through the sympathetic chain or we're synapsing in a collateral ganglion. So the easier version is the correct one. Just first to the sympathetic chain, we synapse, then to the effector organ. Okay. Cool. All right. So for today, you want to know the different branches of the nervous system. Generally, it's going to help you because we're going to do all those other parts of the peripheral nervous system as well. So you want to be able to do after today those different routes that we take for sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves. And we start to have like half of the ways you can differentiate between sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves. And then next, what we're going to talk about are different chemical messengers and receptors for the peripheral nervous system. So we're going to be thinking about neurotransmitters, basically. We're going to have different ones for the sympathetic nervous system versus the parasympathetics. And we're going to have to think about, is this neurotransmitter in the ganglion between the preganglionic and postganglionic neuron? Or is it a synapse between the postganglionic neuron and the effector organ? Okay. So you'll get some short videos on that to watch on Friday, or at least before Monday, and then we'll review it on Monday a little bit before we move forward.